Let me tell you about a boy named Pierre. He was just 10 years old when the world around him erupted into chaos. You wouldn't have noticed him if you passed him on the streets of Paris, just another street urchin, thin and ragged, with eyes too old for his face. But Pierre saw things that day, things that would change him forever. It was the summer of 1789, and the air was thick with tension. Pierre told me how he crouched behind a barrel near the place to grieve, watching as the crowd gathered. They were angry, their voices rising like a storm. He didn't understand the words they shouted, liberty, equality, fraternity, but he felt their rage. It was the same rage that filled his belly when he went days without food, the same rage that made the cobblestones feel like they were shaking beneath his feet. Pierre became a shadow in those days, slipping through the streets like a ghost. He told me how he watched the mob storm the Bastille, their faces wild with fury. He saw the soldiers fall, their uniforms stained with blood, and he hid in alleyways as the city burned. He remembered the faces most of all. There was the baker's wife, her cheeks streaked with tears as she clutched her children. There was the nobleman, his fine coat torn, pleading for mercy as the crowd dragged him away. Pierre wanted to look away, but he couldn't. This was his world now, a world where the powerful fell and the powerless rose, if only for a moment. He began to follow the crowds, not out of courage, but out of curiosity. He wanted to understand what had turned his city into a battlefield. He listened to the speeches in the squares, the fiery words of men like Robespierre and Danton. They spoke of freedom, of a new world, but all Pierre saw was destruction. The day the king was brought to the guillotine, Pierre was there. He stood at the edge of the Place de la Révolution, his breath visible in the cold winter air. The crowd was a living thing, pulsating with anticipation. Pierre could feel their energy, their hunger for justice, or was it vengeance? When the king appeared, his face pale but calm, a hush fell over the crowd. For a moment, even Pierre felt the weight of what was about to happen. The blade fell with a sickening thud, and the crowd erupted into cheers. Pierre didn't cheer. He couldn't. He just stood there, frozen, as the blood pooled on the ground. He told me later that it was the sound he remembered most, the metallic clang of the guillotine, the roar of the crowd, the silence that followed. It was a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his days. In the weeks that followed, the city changed. The streets were quieter, but the air was heavier, as if the very stones of Paris were mourning. Pierre saw the revolutionaries turn on each other, their ideals crumbling like the walls of the Bastille. The baker's wife was gone, her shop boarded up. The nobleman's mansion stood empty, a shell of its former glory. Pierre survived, as he always had, by staying invisible. He stole bread when he could, slept in doorways when he had to. But he was no longer just a street urchin. He had seen too much, felt too much. The revolution had taken his innocence, and in its place, it left a hollow ache. Years later, Pierre still walked those streets, now a man but forever marked by the boy he was. He told me how the revolution promised a new world, but for people like him, the world remained the same. The powerful still ruled, the poor still suffered, and the streets still echoed with the cries of the forgotten. Pierre often wondered if it was worth it, the blood, the chaos, the lives lost. Perhaps it was. Perhaps it wasn't. All he knew was that he was there, a small voice in the chorus of history. And though his story may never be told in the grand halls of power, it is a story that deserves to be remembered.